Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on today's episode of Your Double Podcast. I am here with Amy Baker. Amy, I'd love for you to just tell us a bit about who you are and your expertise in the field.
Sure. So my professional name is Amy J.L. Baker, in case anybody wants to Google me. I imagine there are other Amy Bakers out there, so that's how I differentiate myself. I have a PhD in developmental psychology from Columbia University, and I'm primarily a researcher. And I've done a lot of research in the field of parental alienation since about 2005. And that's really kind of brought me into this field of high conflict divorce and kids who were cut off from a parent and parents who were cut off from a child. And I also provide coaching for parents who identify as being a targeted parent. And I can say more about that at some point. And I help parents at sort of every aspect of this, people who were never married, people who are still married, people who are separated, people who are divorced, people who have, infants, 50-year-old, people who saw their kids yesterday, people who haven't seen their kids in 10 years, all related to the situation of parental alienation, which loosely defined is a dynamic in which a parent manipulates a child to unjustifiably reject the other parent. So I try to help parents who are in that situation be more effective in their interactions with their children.
Yeah. Wow, that's a huge spectrum. Lots of important work there. I find that when parents first start being alienated, they often don't even know that parental alienation is a thing. And I've had so many parents come to me and say this even after perhaps a family abduction, as I kind of Googled the symptoms, if you will, and discovered like there is an actual term. So can you go in a bit more about like what are the signs for parents and maybe even for children, especially adolescents, teenagers, young adults who might be more conscious of what's happening? What are kind of the typical signs to ask you, questions to ask yourself, like, am I being alienated from my child or my parent?
So the basic premise is that your child is starting to relate to you in a way that's not reality based, that's based more on a pre-existing belief that's being imparted into them by the other parent, which can be boiled down to the parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. And the way that the targeted parent experiences that is that their child seemingly suddenly, but could be over a period of time, doesn't trust them, is suspicious of their motives. Oh, you only bought me that bike to look good when you go to court, rather than, gee, Dad, thanks for that great gift. Or, oh, Mom, you're only letting me stay up late because you're weak and pathetic, rather than, gee, thanks for that extra half hour. That means a lot to me. So from the experience of the parent, it's, gee, my child sees the worst in me, and they find a way to look at everything I'm doing as bad, wrong, and stupid. I mean, that's the sort of technical way to describe it experientially. And what happens then is a lot of parents um, start to respond to the child in a way that sadly reinforces the lie. So if the lie is that you're unsafe, unloving, and unavailable, too often parents in this situation start, if your child comes home and calls you by your first name, hey, Amy, instead of hi, mom, or all the other things that we know, stealing from you or spying on you or referring to somebody else as mom or dad when you're the mom or dad, all those things. When the child starts doing that, the parent often responds with either anger and getting stricter and stricter and meaner, reinforcing the idea that you're unloving, or they respond by getting demoralized, depressed, despairing, passive. And either way, they're sort of the twin devils of this situation. It reads to the child as, gee, mom's right, dad's a creep, or gee, mom's right, or dad's right, mom doesn't care. So the main thing that I try to do in the coaching is help parents navigate so they don't inadvertently reinforce the lie. Because once you've made the lie a truth, you're that becomes the whole narrative. Everything is that bad thing you just did today. That's the reason I've been mad at you for the last year, which obviously is illogical, right? B cannot cause A has to cause B sequentially, but that becomes the narrative. So,
And how common would you say this is in today's society? And is it just between a parent and a child, or can it happen between other family members as well?
so people talk about the epidemic, as if it's getting worse. And we don't have uh, epidemiological data to say it's this common the uh, in the United States or in this country with this time, and oh, now it's getting worse. We don't really know, and it also depends on how you define it. How common is it? So there's two ways to think about alienation. One is the behavior that the parent is doing to turn the child against the other parent. And there's some reason to believe that occurs in about 80% of divorce. Then there's the smaller set of cases in which the child becomes turned against the other parent. So some parents do it a little bit and it doesn't make a big splash. Some parents aren't very effective. It's very transparent and the kid doesn't kind of fall for it. Some parents don't have enough access. So even though they're trying, they can't kind of get any purchase, in that direction. So there's a large number of parents who are doing some aspects of this. And then there's a smaller set, but still meaningful, of kids who come to believe that they hate the other parent and will cut them off. That was the first part. The second question you asked was, the first one was how common is it? What was the second part?
Yeah. Is this can it only happen between a parent and a parent-child relationship, or can it happen among other relationships, if you will, in the family?
So it's an interesting question because the term is parental alienation, and I've always thought about it as a thing that one parent does to another parent. But the parents who are losing their kids think this is a thing that's happening to me. And I do know cases where it was an aunt and not the parent who did it, or the grandparents. I know a case where trying to think of what the story is. Like the dad was married to a woman, and I think the woman died, and the parents of the woman who died, the mother, sort of took the kids away from the dad. So that's a case where it's parental alienation because the dad lost his kids, but it wasn't the mom because she had passed away. It was her family. If you start to get into like teacher, coach, therapist, doing this, friend doing it, boyfriend, girlfriend doing it, new spouse doing it, I would rather we call that something else, um, because the model for establishing parental alienation, what we call the Baker model or the five-factor model, is really built on child under 18 to parents doing, involved, sort of a more typical scenario. So if you want to establish it in court or look at the research, that's what the research is focused on. If you're going to get into like coercive control, I think there's other research that would be more relevant.
Very interesting. So you mentioned the Baker model, which I assume then is some type of model to show the evidence in court that parental alienation is happening. Can you walk us a bit through that model? I think parents would be
Sure.
really interested.
The first thing I want to say is when this starts to happen to people, and if they're going to court or thinking about going to court, and they Google, why does my child hate me all of a sudden, and they come across parental alienation online, I think that's a very powerful moment for people because it's kind of the first time they figure out like I'm not crazy, I'm not the only one. There's a name, there's a pattern, there's a model, there's data, there's support groups, there's people who can help. I'm 100% down with that. The caveat that I have is not every case of PA needs to talk about PA in court. We do
Mhm.
have a model, and I'm happy to go through it. It's my model. I love it. I believe in it. The research is there, but that doesn't mean it helps to talk about it in court. There's a lot of things when you go to court. You could ask for reunification therapy. You could ask for supervised visits. You could ask for sanctions against the other person. You could ask for a modification of the parenting time. You could talk about enforcement of the parenting time, et cetera, et cetera. There are only some of those situations where you even need to talk about parental alienation in court. If you do, then talking about the Baker model is the way to go. But that doesn't mean every time you go to court, you need to throw out there, this is parental alienation, because that has many, many, many downsides to it. So it really has to be essential for the judge to believe it's parental alienation for you to get what you want in court. And there's lots of things you can ask for where the cause of the rift between you and your child is not relevant for getting the judge to give you what you want. So the Baker model, there's 5 factors. The first is really a precondition. We used to call it the 4-factor model, and somebody convinced me to call it the 5-factor model by making the precondition the first factor. And I still sort of am a little annoyed with myself for agreeing to that. The first factor is the precondition. There's a breach in the relationship. Otherwise, you wouldn't be talking about it's the other parent's fault, right? You wouldn't have to be talking about what's the explanation for the breach. And that's why, to me, it's really a precondition. And it's the only factor that everybody agrees on. There's never a dispute about whether there's a problem. It's just what's the cause of the problem. So the second factor is that there was a prior positive relationship between the now rejected parent and the child. They put in their time. They, loved the child and had a relationship with the child. It shows that their parenting capacity is normative, that there was an existing relationship. Like I had a case once where somebody was basically out of the child's life for their first 11 years, comes back. I think they were in jail maybe, but I'm not sure I remember. They come back, they want contact, the child is resistant, and they're like, oh, it's alienation. And so that doesn't meet my criteria. That would fail at factor 2. There was a breach, but so it went through factor 1, but factor 2, it bombed out. There was never a relationship. Factor 3 is absence of abuse or neglect. That means that the now rejected parent didn't do anything that would cause the child to realistically reject them. And, there's a lot of clinical data and research data that shows that many, 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 many abused and neglected kids beaten, molested, etc., still want a relationship with the parent who did these terrible, terrible things to them. But if a child was beaten, molested, abused, and did not want a relationship with that parent who did those terrible things to them, we would not call that alienation. That would then be estrangement, realistic estrangement. So that's a case that would bomb out at factor 3. Yes, there's a breach. Maybe they had a prior positive relationship, but then the parent does something terrible, bombs out, does not meet the model. Factor 4 is that the favored parent has engaged in many, there's no hard and fast number, many of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. That list of 17 behaviors is represents the accumulation of lots and lots of different research studies of interviews of adults who lived through this as kids, parents currently living through it, surveys, etc., focus group, like the whole thing, lots of different types of research, qualitative, quantitative. We boiled down all the bad things a parent could do to turn a child against another parent into this list of 17 things. And you have to be able to show that the other parent did these things in order to say that alienation is occurring. You can't just say, they must be doing it because my kid is mad at me all the time. You have to show the screenshot, where the parent says, remember, that other parent is an idiot and you don't have to listen to them, or something like that. And there's 17 different things that a parent could do. And then the 5th factor is that the child is exhibiting all 8 of the behavioral manifestations of alienation. These come from Dr. Richard Gardner's clinical observations, but have been supported now through research. And those 8 behaviors are different than behaviors that abused kids show towards their abusive parents. So we actually did research asking clinicians who work only with moderately and severely abused kids and ask them, do your clients behave this way towards the parent who abused them? And we gave them lots of behaviors, and they basically sorted into the alienation behaviors, and they said, nope, 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 they don't do these things. And then other things, yep, 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 they do these things. So that's the model. And the nice thing about the model is it takes behavior from each of the parties into account, the rejected parent, the favored parent, and the child. And they all have to line up to say that a case is alienation.
Yeah, I love that it's so kind of systematic and very, very clear for something that is very complex for a lot of parents or children that are experiencing this. I'll be sure to link in the various things that you mentioned in the description, such as those 17 behaviors that the parent may exhibit, as well as the eight, you said the behaviors that the child may exhibit, right? And then more information about the Baker model. So obviously that you mentioned that that could at times be used in court, not like a free for all, throw it, the judge all the time. But I assume it's also probably a pretty powerful tool for any parent that's really trying to understand if this is actually happening to them, just to use in their every, day life practically and sit down and go through the steps. Would you say that is the case?
Sure. I think that is definitely something I advise to a lot of my clients is to start a log. What is something that
Mm.
your child is exhibiting behaviors that are confusing to you. Let's see if that lines up with any of the 8 behavioral manifestations. What are the things? A lot of times people, when they do the log, they're like, oh my God, this is so much worse than I thought. Like the other parent did 13 of the 17 alienation strategies. And sometimes it's not as bad. Um, I think you were frozen, by the way. I think you just froze, and I don't know if that means I froze.
Okay, it's better now. I could hear
It's
you,
better
so hopefully it
now.
comes
Yeah.
through.
Okay. Sometimes it's not as
Okay.
bad. People are like, this is the worst case of alienation. And then they do a checklist and they're like, gee, I guess it's just the other parent is doing this one thing and I really don't like it. And so maybe it's not as bad as they think it is. So I think seeing where you stack up against the model is a very helpful first start.
Great. Yeah, I think that is a great start for parents that are feeling not knowing where to kind of check their feelings. What would be then your advice to parents if they go through this model and they start seeing that their case seems to fit in with this model, that the evidence is showing based on this model that they are being alienated from their child? Before we get to the courts and all of that, like what are some practical steps they can take in their daily life, either I guess with a child, with the other parent, to try and I guess address this heads on in a very sensitive and practical manner?
So the first thing not to do is to tell the other parent they're like an evil alienator or tell the child that they're being programmed or brainwashed, because all you're going to do then is just, hurt everybody's feelings. Nobody wants to think that they're being unduly influenced. It goes against the sort of American, I know myself and self-determination that's sort of bred into us in our society. Um, Humans have maybe it's even an innate need to see themselves as being the agents of their own thoughts and feelings. And so if you tell a child you're being brainwashed, it's very offensive and just hurts their feelings. Likewise, if you accuse the other parent of being a narcissist, gatekeeping, love bombing, gaslighting, toxic, blah, blah, it's just going to antagonize the other person. I think in terms of going back to the idea of keeping a journal, it might be helpful to see not just what the other parent is doing, but trying to figure out, are you doing something that's triggering it? Like a lot of times people are actually engaging in behaviors that are, I shouldn't say a lot of the time, sometimes, I don't know how frequent, they're doing something, introducing a new girlfriend into the mix, and then that's triggering the other parent to feel, threatened and to sort of hunker down and want to, you know, sort of grab onto the kid. So I think looking at yourself first is always a good thing to do. Am I doing something that's instigating the other person to feel threatened? And maybe even to ask them, like, hey, how do you think this co-parenting is going? Is there anything I'm doing that's upsetting you? And then if they're doing something, let's say they want the kids to call the new, girlfriend mommy instead of Sally, right? That would be very threatening for any mom. The targeted parent could politely ask. I'm not saying they're going to get their way, but it's always nice to start with a polite request. Something like, hey, Bob, I'm just going to make up something, I'm under the impression that, not the kids told me, I'm under the impression that the kids are calling your new girlfriend mom. If I'm correct, I am politely asking that you don't do that. That doesn't really feel good for me. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. I'm happy to talk about this if you want. So you don't start with an accusation. I know you are doing X, but just I think you might be, or I'm under the impression that you might be. Now, it's not likely the other person's going to say, my bad, oops, I'll never do that again. But they might. And you want to try to solve the problem at the lowest level of animosity and antagonism as you can. And sometimes people sort of come in guns blazing, and that just sets everything off. Likewise, if you feel that your kid is starting to be mistrustful of you, suspicious of your intentions, you might want to look at your parenting, see how you can up your parenting game. You could even ask your child, hey, how do you think our relationship's going? I feel there's some tension between us. I'm wondering what that's about. And if it's not alienation and there is something that you're doing, that would be the best way to catch it. I believe in inviting criticism. I mean, have a suggestion box, in your house. Like, try to figure out what's going on. What can you do, if anything, to try to improve the relationship? In my experience, most parents could improve their parenting. Most parents do not take parenting classes or think that much about what kind of parent they want to be. And most of us parent either the way we were parented or the opposite. We think it's the opposite of the way we were parented. And I'm just a real, believer in um, thinking more reflectively and intentionally about what kind of parent you want to be. So I think those are good
Yeah, no, I think
places
that's,
to start before you go to court.
yeah, agreed. I think that's very powerful. I've had cases of parents who had their children abducted and then they were reunited, but reunited back in a co-parenting environment. So maybe not what people would assume when they watch movies, when we have parental abduction, but what often happens on the ground where alienation didn't just stop because the parent, left behind parent, as we like to call them, is now back in the child's life. That child, still living with the parent who abducted them, and alienation is still happening. And I really see that those parents were best able to handle the situation and rebuild that relationship with their children because they would do healthy things like journal, or if they would get a message from the other parent that really just set them off, they're so angry, they would write the response that they wanted to write on their computer or in their journal, and then they would just save it away and write kind of the more diplomatic nice thing, because they knew that they had to have a relationship with this parent in order to have a relationship with their child. And those have been the cases that I've seen the most successful. Are they perfect? No, by no means, but they are able to have a better relationship with their child and rebuild that relationship because they're willing to take a step back and not just act immediately with their emotions, right?
100% agree with that. Um, the don't hit the send button when you're, dysregulated emotionally yourself is a great place to start. And that requires that people know themselves. What happens to my mind and body when I get dysregulated? Is my heartbeat or my throat closes up or my cheeks are burning, my brain is spinning? They have to understand that we don't all hum like emotional regulation all the time. We do, we're not just toddlers, who have meltdowns. Adults have it too. It just looks different, but the outcome isn't very good for them either. If you get dysregulated, it's important to know, like, oh, now I'm not in a state where I should be hitting the send button on anything.
Yeah. And what about those cases where maybe there have been years of alienation and so it will be much more challenging to reverse the situation or rebuild the relationship with the children? Like what is your usual advice for those parents in that type of situation?
So I think I've seen every conceivable permutation. So I'm not sure I would say like the longer it went, the harder it was. It's so much about what was the relationship before there was a cutoff and how long there was a cutoff, how old the child was, how bad was the alienator. You know, Sometimes people come to me and they tell me, like, the other parent is really mean to my child and bosses them around and won't let them have any friends and wants them to fail in school. And as bad as that is to worry that your child is in a situation like that, in a way, that's a kid who's probably more likely to come back than the really, seemingly supportive alienator parent who showers the kid with, wonderful opportunities and treats them really nicely. So there's so many factors. So to be clear, I think what I'm saying is it's not just about time, it's about how bad
Yeah.
is the alienator. And you don't want your kid to suffer, but on the other hand, if the kid's unhappy with the alienator, that is something that makes it more likely for them to come back. So it's not a terrible thing. To me, the worst, the hardest stories are where the alienator is actually really able to support the child and help them, have a wonderful life. And even the cases where the adult child works for the alienator in their company and married that parent's best friend's kid, they're so in it. Their whole life, their work, their family, their romantic life, money, it's all tied up with the alienator. Those are the tougher cases.
Mm.
Um, because the kid has so much more on the line when they do want to separate. They're going to lose their job and maybe their spouse, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many permutations
Yeah.
to this, so many factors. How hard did the targeted parent try? The parents who do better are the parents who eat a lot of what to get through this situation and hang in there and text their kid every day. I know a parent who called her kid every single day, and just got a voicemail. But you know what? Once in a blue moon, the kid would actually answer the phone and chat. And that parent never started the call with, why didn't you pick up yesterday? And why are you treating me like this? And don't you know this is killing me? And when am I going to see you? It was just, hey, honey, it's so great to hear your voice. So the parents who I think do better throughout the whole process are the parents who aren't angry at the kid and sort of take the kid on their own terms. When they come back, you can't, sadly, frustratingly, you can't expect a big apology and a big, I see all the ways in which I hurt you, even though the parent wants that. So I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question, but I'm trying to give you a flavor of how complicated it is.
Yeah.
I don't see any particular formula, but I'm happy to, if you have another question related to connecting with the kid, I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, so I guess my follow-up question would be then like what would your advice then be to parents? Is there a certain kind of specialist coaching session that they need, given that every situation is so different and we know that one route is through the courts and that can be successful, maybe it's not successful, but just managing this, their expectations, their behaviors, really thinking very proactively on how to act, what advice would you give those parents?
So the thing that's very, very varied is the particular pathway from alienation to coming back. The thing that's to me 100% consistent is what I think a targeted parent should do.
Hmm.
So just to be clear, it's not like, oh, it's so idiosyncratic, we can't possibly
Okay.
know what to do. I believe I know what the targeted parent should do under every circumstance. Safe, loving, and available. That is your North Star. You want every interaction with your child to end with the child thinking, oh, that went okay. So, how you then apply that is really what I do in my coaching, but I'll just sort of give you a flavor. There are a couple of scenarios that come up over and over and over again, whether you have a 10-year-old who you see half time or you have a 30-year-old who you're seeing for the first time in 10 years. It doesn't matter. The scenario that will come up is the accusation that you did something that you did not do. Whether it's you beat me when I was a baby, you didn't want me to be born, you were mean to mommy or daddy, whoever the other parent is, you stole my college money. There's always something. And the targeted parent, the instinct that they have is the wrong instinct because the instinct is to correct the lie because the parent thinks, oh, my child is mad at me because they believe X. Just fill in the blank, whatever it is. And if I tell them that X didn't happen, they won't be mad at me anymore. And I can tell you that that does not work. In fact, I used to give these workshops back before COVID when everything was in real life. And I would say, I'd have 200 parents in the audience and I'd say, raise your hand if your child accused you of stealing their college money. That was just a very common one. Let's say 50 parents raised their hand. It's surprisingly common. And then I'd say, keep your hand raised if you found the piece of paper or online portal that showed the child that the money was still in the bank. And everybody keeps their hand raised because it's human nature. And then I say, keep your hand raised if it made a difference. And everybody puts their hand down. I don't know any case where the child said, oh, gee, thanks for correcting my misunderstanding. Now I'm not mad at you. And the reason it doesn't work is because that's not really what they're mad about most of the time. Maybe there's a case of a 12th grader who's all set to go to college, and that I would understand. But a 4-year-old saying you stole my college money when they don't know what college is and they don't know what money is, seeing a piece of paper with the number is not going to make a difference. The child is not mad about that. What they're saying in the only words they know how is, don't you love me? And so when the parent gets angry and says, look at this piece of paper, how could you think I would steal your money? They're being so unloving in that moment that it actually reinforces the idea that you're not a safe and loving parent because you're so angry, or who told you that? Now you're saying, I care more about who's maligning me than about your feelings. Or if you say, that's ridiculous, you're calling your child an idiot. If you say to your child, you know that's not true, you're calling your child a liar. So it took me a long time. It didn't take me much time to figure out what not to do. It took me a long time to figure out what to do. And so, but I've been blabbing about this all over the place for years. So I developed this thing called the 5 steps. It actually takes me about 40 minutes to teach it to parents, but it's written up in one of my books. And I'm happy to go through the steps, but I really don't think people can do it without reading or hearing all the things that I have to say about it. But it works. It works better than anything else I know because it addresses both the manifest surface lie but it also addresses the underneath lie that you're unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. So um, I can go a little bit more into that, or we could move on, whatever you want.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely add the link to the book in the description if people want to read it. Yeah, if you maybe just want to give, like a big
The two
picture
second
of what it
version.
is and get them, they're interested, then they'll maybe go in and dig deeper into it.
Yep. Okay. So first you have to thank the child. So the first step is gratitude. Thank you so much for telling me. It doesn't mean it's true. So let's say your child accuses you of beating them when they were a baby, which is a pretty extreme thing. You would say, thank you so much for telling me that you think I beat you when you were a baby. So you're not saying, thank you for telling me I beat you when you were a baby, which would be admitting something that's not true. And I don't believe in doing that. And I could talk for half an hour about gratitude and why it works and how it changes the whole tone of the interaction to start with appreciation rather than anger. And I'm going to move on. Step two is called compassion. That's where you try to figure out what is the child feeling in this moment? Are they sad? Are they angry? Are they scared? Are they worried? And then you reflect back to them what you think they're feeling. Like, wow, you seem so angry thinking that I beat you when you were a baby. And I'm noticing your anger and I'm really paying attention to what you're feeling. And again, I could talk for a long time about that. Step three is called empathy. That's where you try to imagine what it would feel like to be a kid who thinks their parent beat them or didn't want them to be born or whatever. And it kind of clues you into the suffering of your child, which is really the only way out of this alienation dynamic is for the parent to care about the child's suffering because it puts you in a more loving frame of mind. Step four is called the minor correction. That's where you very briefly say your truth. So if the accusation is you beat me when I was a baby, you can say, actually, that didn't happen. Very relaxed, not like that did not happen. Like you care more about being right than the child's feelings. Sometimes the accusation is subjective, like you never loved me. And the minor correction would be, I know in my heart that I love you. Very relaxed, very calm. You're speaking your truth. I don't think anybody ever gets to tell anybody else what they think, know, feel, or believe. So I wouldn't want the parent to say, I love you. Just, I know that I love you. And then step five is circling back to gratitude, compassion, and empathy. And it's all explained in the book. And it works a lot of times. People tell me it's very, very helpful. It takes a lot of work. You have to really understand the purpose of each of the steps. But the good news is you don't have to memorize it like a script and you don't have to keep it a secret. You can say to the child, I thought you might bring up something like this. So I wrote down some things I wanted to remember. See, this says gratitude. This is to remind me to thank you. And then you do
Mm.
all that you're supposed to do under gratitude. It's a certain number of sentences in a certain order. And then you can say, and this is compassion. You know, I really want to try to figure out what you're feeling right now. So thankfully, it works even if you acknowledge you're doing something. Just don't reference me because then they Google me and it's alienation. And then that just gets, you just get to say, like, I'm learning new things as parent, and this is something I learned. So
Yeah. And this is really great because again, a lot of parents will come with really no idea where to start. They're just entering this new terrible journey that they didn't even realize existed, a year before, 5 years before, and they're so lost. And this is probably the first time I've heard it in such a, clear-cut, systematic way, which I love. I'm a very systematic person, but I think a lot of parents will appreciate going and knowing like, okay, these are clear actions that I can take to diffuse the situation and improve it. So yeah, I love it. And I'll be linking all of these in the description so parents can dig into them deeper. Um, do you so if parents want to get in touch with you, they want to explore their situation in further detail are interested in your services, can you tell us a bit more about the services you offer to parents, I guess,
sure.
about
So I used to offer the service of being an expert witness, and I did that for a decade. And it was very grueling and horrible. I hated being on the stand. And I learned through doing that A, I didn't like it, didn't want to do it anymore. So I don't do that. But also a lot of times people think they need a PA expert and they don't. And they ended up paying me money to fly me here or there when it wasn't even really necessary. So I don't do that anymore. What I do, and I've been doing it since 2014, I think, is telephone coaching. So telephone, doesn't matter where we are in the world, coaching, not therapy for targeted parents. So that's anybody who self-identifies as being concerned that their relationship with their child is being undermined or interfered with by the other parent. They don't have to prove it's alienation to me. I basically take people at their word and say, well, if what you're saying is true, then here's how I think you might want to handle it.
Mhm.
Um, so coaching is not therapy. We don't talk about people's childhoods. We don't talk about other things that are going on in their life. It's very directive. I'm very bossy as a coach. I'll say, do this, do that, try this, try that. Um, I try to make every session value packed for the person. Um, and so every session is an hour. I charge 240. I really haven't raised my rates other than $10 since I started doing this. And it's not therapy, so there's no expectation that it's weekly. Some people want 3 times a week. Most people want 3, 4, 5 sessions, and then they only come back if there's something new. There's a limit to what I can do since I'm not doing joint therapy. The kid isn't in the session, the other parent isn't in the session. Um, I've had some long-term clients that I've probably had 100 sessions with. I have lots of clients who just want 1 or 2 sessions. It's as needed, directed by the client. And I have clients who still have contact with their kids. And so it's very much focused on, what do I do when my child won't listen to me? What do I do when my child talks to me in a tone of voice that I don't like? Or how
Mm.
do I prepare for a custody evaluation? I'm going into mediation. What are some things I should be thinking about? Then I have a separate set of clients who don't have contact. Their kids are adults over 18. And for them, when I think it makes sense, I help them write a letter to their adult child. That's a whole separate process. I have to get some of the story, then they have to do homework. There's a whole process involved. That's maybe 3, 4 sessions as a set of activities that culminates in them having a letter that they will write to their child that most likely, I can't promise, but most likely it's different than a letter they have already written. So a lot of people are, oh, I already wrote a letter. And I'm like, well, mine might be different. I have a very specific philosophy to the letter, which happens to be in my book, Parenting Under Fire. If people want to get a sense of what it is, and then if they like that, they can come back to me. Um, I have some clients who are really trying to figure out their legal strategy. And sometimes I will meet with them and their lawyer and talk about, like, if you're going to make the case in court for alienation, there's 4 hurdles in the minds of a judge that you have to get them through. And here's what they are, and here's how you do it. Or they might be looking for an expert, and I'll say, well, here are the pros and cons, or different kinds of experts. So it's kind of a range of things, but it's all in that world of alienation.
Interesting. And do you ever work with children or adults who have been alienated or just with the parents?
Nope, just the parents. It's an interesting question. I could work with adults, but I think what they need is therapy. And my PhD is in developmental psychology. I'm not a licensed clinician because developmental is not a licensed field. And I think what they probably want is and need is therapy. So I couldn't offer that.
Mm.
And same thing with the kids. I have to be very careful about staying in my lane. I don't give legal advice, but I'll say, here's 10 questions to ask your attorney. So I don't want to get outside my area of expertise.
So, what would be your advice for, let's say adults that have think that they have been alienated from a parent? Where should they start looking for support?
It's a good question. I think it depends on where they're at in the process. Like, do they have a relationship with the parent who they've been cut off from? Do they want a relationship? Are there things they need to work out before they reach out to that parent? Um, you know, what I have found is when the adult child comes back, that's like the beginning of healing. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen, really. I mean, sometimes they just sort of fall right back into a relationship, but there's a lot of points of friction. Like, can I mention, my marriage when I didn't invite them to my wedding? Or should I mention this? Or, there's just lots of tensions. And so I did develop a program called Restoring Family Connections that a parent and an adult child willingly, voluntarily can go to a licensed clinician and do that program to help them sort of stitch back together the relationship. Um, and it's still possible, I would say, that that adult child needs their own therapy. One of the ways to think about alienation is that it's like a cult. The child has been manipulated to believe things that aren't true, to develop an unnatural dependence on one person. And if sort of my best advice is if you're a young adult and you think you've been cut off from a parent, by the other parent, and you want to try to figure that out, try to find a therapist who works with people who've been in cults. And there's an
Oh,
organization called the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA, and I think they have a website with therapists listed on it because it's very, very similar. How do you get out of a cult? It's similar to how do you get out of alienation. You can be kicked out, you can be counseled out, or you can, and there's the third thing, I can't remember what it is, but you can sort of figure it out yourself and like escape. And each of those different ways of getting out, whether it's from a cult or an alienation dynamic, has different impact on the person. So somebody who knows something about working with undue influence, coercive control, cults might be a good place to go for individual therapy.
mhm. Yeah, that's great, great advice. So, I think our listeners will be very pleased with all the resources you've developed. It's quite amazing, all these books you've written and programs you've developed, and just to have these at their fingertips. Is there anything else that you wanted to, share with parents who might be listening who've been alienated from their children?
Um, I'm sorry you're going through this. It's one of the worst things that can happen to a parent, and my heart is with you. And I will also say, kind of beware of people who will take advantage of you. There are people out there who are not qualified, in my opinion, to be providing services. Maybe they've lived through it themselves, so they have like an N of one experience and they know what worked for them. But anybody who charges you $10,000 up front or doesn't have a degree in psychology or social work, just beware. I'm not saying they're all dangerous, but really be careful. There are people who will take advantage of somebody, you know. Anybody who promises you they'll get you your kid back is probably somebody to stay away from because none of us can promise that.
Yeah. It's really good advice. And yeah, there are unfortunately, sadly, a lot of people out there taking advantage of individuals in vulnerable situations. Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us today, Amy. It's really been a pleasure. I've learned a lot and I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Likewise.